The night Marcus Hale realized his mother might die, he had only $17 in his pocket, a nearly empty gas tank, and a heart so desperate that pride no longer mattered. Rain hammered the windshield of his 10-year-old sedan as he raced through the dark streets of Chicago, Illinois, one trembling hand gripping the steering wheel while the other reached toward the passenger seat every few seconds. His 68-year-old mother, Margaret, lay curled beneath an old blanket, struggling to breathe. Her face had turned frighteningly pale, and every breath sounded weaker than the one before. Marcus kept telling himself they were almost there, that the emergency room would save her, that somehow everything would be okay. But deep inside, he was terrified. He knew they had no insurance, no savings, and no way to pay for whatever treatment she needed. When Marcus finally pulled into the hospital entrance, he jumped out and ran around the car. He opened the passenger door and shouted for help as nurses rushed toward them with a wheelchair. Margaret's eyes opened for a moment, and she looked at her son with the same gentle expression she had worn throughout his childhood. Marcus squeezed her hand and promised her he wouldn't let anything happen to her. He didn't know that those words would soon become the hardest promise of his life. Within minutes, doctors were examining Margaret, checking her oxygen levels, ordering tests, and rushing her toward the emergency department. Marcus stood outside the treatment area soaked from the rain, staring through the glass doors as his mother disappeared from sight. If you believe kindness can change someone's life and that everyone deserves a second chance, take a moment to like the story, share it with someone who needs hope, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel. Sometimes a small act of kindness reaches someone at the exact moment they feel completely alone. Marcus had spent most of his 34 years trying to keep his mother safe. His father had died when Marcus was 12, leaving Margaret to raise him alone. She cleaned hotel rooms during the day and worked evenings at a diner, often coming home after midnight with aching feet and a smile she forced onto her face so Marcus wouldn't worry. She had sacrificed everything for him, and Marcus had never forgotten it. After high school, he had worked construction, warehouse jobs, delivery routes, and anything else that paid enough to keep food on their table. He never became rich, but he always believed hard work would eventually give him a better life. Then, a construction accident changed everything. Marcus injured his back while lifting heavy equipment and lost his job. The medical bills consumed what little savings he had. He started delivering groceries and driving for a rideshare company, working 14-hour days whenever his body allowed it. Still, the rent fell behind. The electricity was nearly disconnected twice. His mother's medications became harder to afford. Yet Margaret always told him that they were rich in the things that mattered because they had each other. Now, standing beneath the harsh fluorescent lights of the hospital hallway, Marcus felt like a failure. A doctor eventually stepped out and asked for him. Her name was Dr. Rebecca Carter, a respected emergency physician in her early 40s. She explained that Margaret was suffering from severe heart complications and needed immediate treatment. There were medications, procedures, monitoring, and possibly surgery ahead. Marcus listened carefully until the doctor mentioned the cost. His stomach dropped. He explained that he didn't have insurance. He promised he would work. He said he would find a way. He offered to sign anything. He even pulled his wallet from his pocket and counted the money in front of the doctor, embarrassed by how little there was.
$70.
Dr. Carter looked at him with compassion, but she was bound by hospital procedures. The emergency team would stabilize Margaret, but some specialized treatment required authorization and financial arrangements. Marcus thanked her, then walked toward a corner of the hallway and sat down. For several minutes, he simply stared at the floor. Then he began to cry. He wasn't crying because he was weak. He was crying because he had spent his entire life believing that if he worked hard enough, he could protect the woman who had protected him. And now, when she needed him most, money stood between them. Marcus wiped his face and returned to the emergency desk. He asked if he could see the doctor again. When Dr. Carter came out, Marcus lowered himself to his knees. He begged her to save his mother. He promised he would repay every cent. He said he would work 2 jobs, 3 jobs, anything. He told her that Margaret was all he had left. Dr. Carter knelt beside him and gently asked him to stand. She told him that his mother's life mattered and that they would do everything they could. But Marcus could see the uncertainty in her eyes. There were limits to what promises could accomplish. Hours passed. The rain outside grew heavier. Margaret's condition worsened. Marcus sat beside the hospital bed when they finally allowed him inside. Machines beeped softly around them. His mother looked tiny beneath the white sheets. Marcus held her hand and remembered being 7 years old, sitting at the kitchen table while Margaret cut one sandwich into 2 pieces because there wasn't enough food for 2 full meals. She had always given him the larger piece. He remembered his first school uniform, his first bicycle, the night he came home after being bullied and found Margaret waiting on the porch, the morning she sold her wedding ring to pay his college enrollment fee. Every sacrifice returned to him like a painful memory. Margaret opened her eyes and whispered that she was proud of him. Marcus tried to smile. He told her she would be home soon. She squeezed his fingers weakly. Then her eyes closed again. Outside the hospital, a black luxury SUV slowly pulled through the emergency entrance. It was the kind of vehicle that seemed completely out of place beside the old taxis and ordinary cars parked beneath the rain. A chauffeur stepped out and opened the rear door. A tall man in an expensive charcoal coat emerged. His name was Jonathan Whitmore. Jonathan was 48 and one of the wealthiest businessmen in Illinois. His technology company had made him a billionaire, but few people knew that he had grown up poor. He had once slept in a 1-bedroom apartment with his mother and younger sister. His mother had worked as a nursing assistant, and she had died when Jonathan was 22 because their family couldn't afford the specialized treatment she needed. Jonathan had spent decades building his fortune, but that night he wasn't at the hospital because of business. He had come to visit an old friend. As Jonathan walked through the entrance, he noticed Marcus sitting alone in the hallway. The young man's clothes were soaked, his shoes were worn, and his face was exhausted. But what caught Jonathan's attention was the way Marcus was staring at a hospital room door. Jonathan had seen that look before. It was the look of someone waiting for a miracle. He continued walking, but after a few steps he stopped. He turned around. Marcus didn't notice him. Jonathan approached the nurse's station and quietly asked what was happening. The nurse couldn't share private medical details, but she mentioned that a patient was in serious condition and that the family was struggling financially. Jonathan's expression changed. He asked whether there was anything he could do. The nurse told him the hospital had charity programs, but specialized treatment could take time to arrange. Jonathan immediately asked to speak with a hospital administrator. Within minutes, several calls were made. Marcus knew nothing about it. He was still sitting beside his mother. Then Dr. Carter entered the room and told Marcus that there had been a change. A specialist had approved an emergency procedure. Marcus looked confused. He asked how. Dr. Carter simply said that someone had agreed to cover the immediate medical expenses. Marcus refused to believe it. He asked who. Before anyone could answer, footsteps approached from the hallway. Jonathan Whitmore walked through the doorway. Marcus stared at him. He didn't understand who the man was or why he was there. Jonathan looked at Margaret through the glass and then back at Marcus. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Jonathan quietly explained that he had once sat in a hospital hallway just like Marcus. His mother had been sick. He had been young. He had had no money. And he had begged doctors to save her. But no one had arrived in time. Jonathan told Marcus that he couldn't change what happened to his own mother, but he could make sure another son didn't have to experience the same helplessness. Marcus broke down. He tried to thank him, but the words wouldn't come. Jonathan placed a hand on his shoulder and told him that he didn't owe him anything. Not money. Not gratitude. Nothing. He only wanted Margaret to live. The surgery began shortly afterward. Marcus sat outside the operating room with his hands clasped tightly together. Jonathan remained nearby. Hours passed slowly. Neither man said much. At one point, Marcus asked why Jonathan would help a stranger. Jonathan looked toward the operating room and admitted that wealth had taught him something poverty never could. Money could buy comfort, but it couldn't buy back time. He had spent years believing that becoming a billionaire would erase the pain of losing his mother. It never did. He said helping Marcus was the first time his fortune had felt useful in a way that mattered. Near dawn, Dr. Carter finally walked into the hallway. She was smiling. Margaret had survived. The procedure had gone well. Marcus covered his face with both hands and cried so hard that his shoulders shook. Jonathan quietly stepped away, but Marcus noticed. He ran after him. He insisted that Jonathan couldn't simply disappear. Jonathan smiled and told him that he had already done enough by reminding him that good people still existed. But the story didn't end at the hospital. Over the next several months, Margaret recovered slowly. Marcus found steady work through a company Jonathan owned, but Jonathan made sure Marcus received the position because he was qualified, not because he was being given charity. Marcus worked hard, learned quickly, and eventually became a supervisor. Margaret returned home. She planted flowers in the small backyard. She baked pies for neighbors. And every Sunday, Marcus came over for dinner. One evening, months after the hospital incident, Jonathan visited their home. Margaret recognized him immediately. She held his hands and thanked him with tears in her eyes. Jonathan told her that she didn't need to thank him. Margaret smiled and said that perhaps he was right because kindness wasn't supposed to be a debt. It was supposed to be something passed forward. Those words stayed with Jonathan. Years later, Jonathan created a foundation that helped struggling families pay emergency medical expenses. Marcus became one of its community coordinators. Margaret became an unofficial symbol of the organization, often reminding volunteers that behind every unpaid medical bill was a human being, a mother, a father, a child, or someone desperately hoping for another morning. The most beautiful part was that Jonathan never called himself a hero. He always said the real heroes were the people who kept going when they had nothing left. Marcus agreed, because he had learned that night that poverty could empty a man's wallet, but it couldn't empty his heart. He had walked into that hospital believing $17 was all he had. He later realized he had something far more valuable. He had love. And sometimes, when love refuses to give up, help arrives from the most unexpected place. If this story touched your heart, please like the video, share it with someone who believes kindness still matters, and subscribe so more stories like this can reach people who need a little hope. And before you leave, comment "Kindness can save a life" if you believe that one compassionate decision can change someone's entire future. Marcus never forgot the night he begged a doctor to save his mother. He never forgot the sound of rain against the hospital windows, or the fear that filled his chest when he thought he might lose her. But he remembered something else even more clearly. The moment a billionaire stepped out of a black car and walked toward a broken stranger, not because he needed recognition, not because he wanted praise, but because years earlier, someone had failed to save the person he loved. That night, Jonathan couldn't save his own mother, but he saved Margaret. And in doing so, he discovered that sometimes the greatest purpose of wealth isn't having more. It's making sure someone else doesn't have to lose everything. The world may remember Jonathan Whitmore as a billionaire. Marcus remembered him differently. He remembered him as the stranger who saw a desperate son on his knees and decided that $17 would not determine whether a mother lived or died. And Margaret remembered him simply as the man who arrived when hope was almost gone. Sometimes, that is all a person needs to become a miracle in someone else's life.